Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a couple minutes real quick and address some questions maybe in Revelation 17 and 18. This weekend in our small group, I was asked a question that I thought was really, really insightful and helpful, and likely a question maybe you're asking yourself. The question really was posed like, how do you know when to interpret literally in Revelation, and how do you know when we should just see these as symbolic? And to be honest, that's the challenge of Revelation. Like, where should we just say, nope, John is being literal, or where we say, no, John is just using symbols? And what I would say is that whenever possible, I try to be literal. I know very well that this is a highly symbolic book. John is using symbols over and over and over again. But I would also argue that I think he's using symbols, but he is giving us statements that will give us like how to interpret those symbols. So case in point, when we look at 17 and 18, like right off the bat, in Revelation 17, it talks about how this great harlot, it's referring to the world as Babylon, or as a harlot. And it says, come here, I'll show you the harlot, and she sits on many waters. And what I told you, or shared with you all, is that when this harlot is sitting on many waters, it's symbolic of, or emblematic, that it's of all the nations, that this harlot has gotten around, that this harlot has permeated not just one city, but all the nations. Now that's using symbolic language, but the reason that I would say literally that it's permeated the entire world is because John actually tells us that. It's that you have to go find it a little bit later, like, because in verse 15, I told you, you can draw a line from verse 1 all the way to 15, because in verse 15 it says, and he said to me, the waters which you saw, i.e. in verse 1, the waters are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And so he's using symbolic language, but he's also interpreting to us like how we should hold like many waters. It's referring to all nations, all tribes, all tongues. And so that's why I would say he's using symbols, and therefore, whenever possible, John oftentimes will give us how we should interpret his symbols. Another one would be found in Revelation 17:9, like when it talks about how the seven heads in verse 9, the seven heads are seven mountains, which the woman sits on. And how I talked about how a mountain is symbolic oftentimes of empires. Mountains are emblematic of kingdoms. And the reason I say that is because, one, you want to read this whenever possible, and then when it's like that just doesn't make sense, then it's like, okay, then we need to be careful. But that's how Scripture oftentimes views mountains. And I said I took us back to, well, I didn't take us, I just referenced Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. But even if you just stay within the text, he's not literally talking about mountains, but he does show us that these mountains are some kind of empire, because it says, right, these seven heads are seven mountains, but in the very next verse it says, and they are what? They are seven kings. 5 have fallen. And so if I'm saying this a reference to an empire, well, what's over empires? Kings. And so that's the challenge, is that where can we see things, okay, that's just symbols, but oftentimes those symbols are giving a further explanation, sometimes immediately after, sometimes several verses later. And so I just try to find the text and say, all right, this is what I believe John is saying. Where it gets really, really tricky, though, is with numbers. And we're going to find out that's the case even this upcoming weekend. Is the number symbolic, or should we take the number literally? And oftentimes, like even what we'll get into this weekend, is that they will say John is just using numbers in symbolic ways. Don't take them literally. And I do understand that. I get why many godly pastors and theologians take those numbers symbolically, but at the same time, wherever possible, I'm going to take a literal interpretation. So if you remember in Revelation 4 and 5, Jesus, this lion lamb one, has seven horns, right? And seven eyes. And the seven spirits of God are throughout the earth. Like, those numbers are being actually symbolic. I would wholly interpret that way. I think what John is showing us in Revelation 4 and 5 is that Jesus has perfect power. And Jesus has perfect sight. He's all-knowing. And Jesus' presence, it is a perfect present. He is omnipresent. But at the same time, you look at Revelation 2 and 3, and we see the seven churches. I don't think too many of us would say, oh, it's not actually referring to seven churches. It's just referring to a perfect number of churches. No, I would say, like, I think John has seven churches in mind. And so I recognize that's where numbers can be tricky. Should we be literal? Should we be symbolic? And as we go into Revelation 19 and 20, and we see this millennial kingdom where Christ is going to reign for 1,000 years, that's why some hold like, yes, I believe he will physically reign for 1,000 years. Or some will say, John is not referring to a specific period of time. It's just that God is reigning. And so I'll be addressing that this weekend as we jump into Revelation 19 and 20.